are joined today by Mr. Mark Herring, the Dean of Library Services at Winthrop University, who is set to retire this month, but not before coming under a little bit of controversy before he retires. Mr. Winthrop, how are you?
Mr. Herring, yes. I am doing fine tonight. How are you?
I'm doing well. So we'll jump right into what's going on. You write for a publication called Against the Grain, and you wrote an op-ed that was published about in light of the coronavirus, and you came under some controversy after it was put out for using terms such as Wuhan wildings and Wuhan virus. This invoked a good amount of criticism from academia, from fellow professors and librarians alike. So summarize the article for us and walk us through what happened after it was published.
Well, yes, before I go into that, let me just say that I'm speaking on behalf of myself, not on behalf of the university, not on behalf of the library. I just want to make that clear to your listeners. I have been in this job for 21 years. I have written for Against the Grain for 16 of those years. I also did conferences for them. I probably reviewed a couple of score papers for them for publication. And this came as a big surprise because I knew all of the editors. A couple of them I was very close friends with. And during this isolation, this shutdown, which seems to be a memory now in light of the shoulder-to-shoulder protests we're seeing all over the country. But in any event, during the isolation, I decided to write something about that. Normally, I write about mainly boring topics that deal only with professional librarianship, things about book publishing, things about ebooks, that sort of thing. But occasionally, during the 16 years, I've taken on a different tack and talked about other things. And this particular time, I thought I would talk about why we were going through what we were going through. The first piece I did in the column, I do a column and have been doing a column for most of those 16 years called Little Red Herrings. And in this particular column, I decided to do something on the Wuhan virus. And there were really three reasons I wanted to do that or wanted to get across. One was I didn't want people to lose track of where this came from. Everybody's calling it COVID-19, and that's fine. But in 5 years, nobody's going to remember that it came from China. And I thought that was important that we try to remember that because I think it has a lot to do with how we go forward in our dealings with that nation. The other thing I wanted to get across is that crises tend to bring out the best and worst in people. I gave a couple of examples for that, on both sides. And then lastly, I wanted to get across to people that maybe going forward, we can focus on what's really important in life rather than on some trivial things. So I sent the article in. The editors did some changes. They sent it back to me. I made some changes. I sent it back to them. It was published. It was published in the print version. It was published on the online version. It was the online version that I think created the most controversy. Couple of dozen, as I understand it, maybe just 2 dozen people were very upset that it was racist and xenophobic because I said it was the Wuhan virus rather than COVID-19. And they also said that I had mentioned some things about cultural differences that were wrong. Not that they were wrong that I reported them, that I was wrong to report them. My daughter had spent, one of my daughters had spent almost a year in China, and I related one of the stories that she told. I was told I should not have related that story. The story was about a really beautiful restaurant. She was hoping that if we came over, she could take us to that restaurant. And it was, as nice as any 4 or 5-star restaurant in the United States. Only the second time she went, she discovered that they were cooking dog in the back of the restaurant. So I mentioned that not to criticize, but simply to point out the differences between the two cultures. Now, I did mention the wet markets in this article, and I mentioned that I thought it was time that we consider putting pressure on China to remove those or to do something about them. We know that the last 3 Havana viruses have come from wet markets, or the COVID viruses have come from wet markets, or have had some connection with those. Whether this one came from a laboratory, from someone who then went to a wet market, and then it promulgated from there, we're not quite sure, but we do know that it was in Wuhan and that it had something to do with being in that general vicinity. But what apparently upset a lot of people was talking about those cultural differences, saying that it was the Wuhan virus. And I did mention that a friend of mine had called it the Kung flu, which apparently was the wrong thing to mention. I was simply throwing that in as a bit of comic relief, but apparently it was not funny. I should have known better. I've been in higher education for almost 40 years. I should know that the left has a very thin sense of humor, but that created part of the controversy. The editors of that magazine, some of whom I thought were good friends, unilaterally retracted the article and apologized for it. After that, some of the social media comments, not only on their website, came over to the website where I work, the Winthrop website. The provost decided that she needed to respond, so she responded disassociating the university from me and from the comments that I had made in the article. She then decided to put some of those on the Winthrop site as well. All of that I found out after the fact. And a few days after that, indicated to me that she had to send a letter out to all faculty and staff because the issue had come up in staff conference. Now, I emphasize that because this is a professional library publication. We have librarians who do not read this publication, but somehow staff at Winthrop brought this up in staff conference. That is fairly odd to me because our staff conference is made up of a lot of people, not any of whom are librarians. So that was a little bit puzzling to me, but she decided at that point that she needed to send out a letter to all faculty and staff, using the usual line that comes about these sorts of things, that we're all about diversity, we're all about inclusion, we're all about all of the sorts of things that you normally hear in cases like this. And said to me after the fact again that this was something that she had to do. I did ask to see the statement before she sent it out. She told me I could not. And I saw it when it came out to all faculty and staff. A few days, we have a thing called Digital Commons. It's an institutional repository where faculty put everything they do, or tend to put everything they do, in this particular repository. It's one that I brought to the campus about a decade ago. And the idea is for it to be a kind of intellectual footprint for an institution. A lot of institutions have this. Over 5,000 institutions have a digital commons. And I have always put my work there, whether it was published or not. Most of the time it had been published, but I'd put it there, usually before or right after I published something. I had put this article and a follow-up article on there. The first article was called Wuhan Wilding. The second was called Work in the Wuhan Wilderness. She told me about 2 days after sending the email out to faculty and staff that she was withdrawing that from the digital commons. Now, I found that out after the fact, but she did apologize for having me find out after the fact, but that she went ahead and pulled those because it was not in the spirit of the Winthrop campus. We had a long discussion about academic freedom and intellectual freedom. I argued that I felt like this was an infringement on my academic freedom. And I did ask if the other 20,000 pages we have in the digital commons had been examined. to see if any of those had any kind of sentiment that did not agree with the institution. That has not happened, of course. In fact, in the 10 years that I have overseen the Digital Commons, we have never had a paper retracted. We've never pulled a paper. We have had a couple of authors say they would like for us to embargo it for a few months before we put it up for public consumption. But this was an unprecedented move, I thought. And it not only was censored at the magazine, but it has been censored from the university repository. I have since placed it elsewhere so it can at least be looked at. But this has been, it's been a very interesting few weeks. I mean, I'm less than 20 days from retirement. I didn't expect a gold watch, but I didn't expect to be kicked in the shins either. So this has been a strange place for me to be, but it's kind of where we are, I think, with academic campuses. We know from the research from Paul Lazarsfeld and Seymour Martin Lipset and others, the university tends to be far left of center rather than just left of center, and I think that's held true for more than 50 years. I had felt like for a long time that, at least while I had been at Winthrop up until the last 3 or 4 years, that we were at least able to get along, but that seems to have changed when this happened. And I'll add just one other little sidebar. I have been the faculty advisor for the college Republicans for about a decade at the campus. We've had a couple of presidents who have interceded on things that have come up during that time, nothing terribly serious, but I had one former president who complained that I said the university was left of center. He didn't think that was right, but anyway, the university in general, not the specific university at Winthrop. And he complained about that, but nothing really has been quite like this. I have asked almost a dozen faculty to take my place since I'm stepping down. None of them will take that place. And at the time, they worried about promotion, tenure, and how they would be treated. I thought that was maybe a little bit too fearful on their part. Since this has happened, I'm not so sure they weren't right. It's too bad that that's kind of where we are, but apparently that's where we are now.
Right, and I want to focus a little bit on the comments that you received for putting this out. The Chinese American Library Association were the group that made the remarks that it was racist and xenophobic, and
Right.
They said that it was the epitome of ignorance and white supremacy in our profession, in the librarian profession, I assume. So the indication here is that the article and you are a white supremacist for calling it the Wuhan virus. And
Yes.
so what's your response to this when it's, to me, I read the piece and I saw that you would use those terms, but it was pretty obvious that you were not, if I think I'm speaking correctly, that you were labeling it for its origins and obviously not for the people.
No, of course not. In fact, I even said in the article that the people, it was sad that the people were in a government that essentially is, that is Marxist totalitarian, and they sometimes have no choice, or most of the time have no choice. And it had nothing to do with the people. It had to do with the origin of that virus. And that's what I didn't want people to lose. The American Library Association has also jumped in with I think it's the Asian Pacific Library Association,
right,
who wrote that particular comment. And it's baffling to me because if everything is racist, we end up with nothing being racist. And particularly at this time in the horrific murder of George Floyd, I think we really need to be careful about how we label things and just willy-nilly name everything a certain thing, because we lose the power of it when something like the George Floyd murder comes to pass. And I think that's really important. When I talked to my provost, she indicated to me that I was guilty of casual racism. Now, the first thing that I thought about was, oh, great. the left gave us casual sex, and now we've got casual racism. It really is baffling to me that this is where we are at the university level, and this is the kind of conversations that we have to have. I don't really know what casual racism is. Apparently, it's something you can do when you're not even aware of it, when you're not even thinking about it, in which case that would mean everyone is guilty of it, which maybe that's what they would like to get across. But it's outrageous. I saw the piece that that the Asian Pacific Library Association put out. They obviously didn't read the article. The follow-up piece that I did called Work in the Wuhan Wilderness was also censored by the magazine. Both of those are on Academia EDU if people want to look at them. But it really is surprising to me that we can't have a conversation about something that was really important apparently 90 days ago. It seems to be less important now that we all stay home and be isolated and not get shoulder to shoulder with people. But it seems to me that we really needed to have something to help us get through that and to realize that maybe something good could come out of it. And instead, something like this did.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Winthrop, up until a few years ago, was an atmosphere in which you thought everyone could get along, left or right. You thought that it was a pretty fair, playing field. But now we're starting to see an increasingly blatant, leftism creeping into academia, into the universities. So is this something that you find has become radicalized at Winthrop? And what do you think the solution is, across the country as these schools are becoming, blatantly biased and blatantly one-sided? What do you think the solution is? How are we as conservatives going to mitigate that?
That's a really good question. I would have said 5 or 6 or 7 years ago that parents should not hesitate to send children to the university or to colleges, and just be sure they have a good foundation, a good grounding, and in terms of what they want their children to believe. But honestly, now, given what has transpired, it seems to me that I feel that's less of something that I would be willing to push hard about. I think as conservatives, if we want to continue to preserve that idea and that way of thinking, we're going to have to figure out what we do about educating young people. It's very hard to send anyone, even with a very good background, to a public institution. And I've worked in private institutions. In fact, I worked with church-related institutions that had just as much liberalism as public ones. And I think part of that is just the nature of what attracts people to the university setting. But in any event, I think that we have to give some thought about that and what we're going to do about that going forward. Because unless a young person is really, really well-grounded going forward, there will be some attenuation of their belief. And I think that's what, I think whether they know it or not, or whether they realize it or not, that's what happens in the university setting. I mean, we were constantly getting things about, in emails about how we address people, about how we say things, about the way we present different ideas. One of the things that I mentioned before was I gave an example at a meeting of Republicans that had come on campus, and I thought I was helping out because I felt like I was bringing a group of people on campus who probably would not have come on campus had we not done the program we had done. We brought in some Republican legislators from South Carolina onto the campus to talk about different events. And I thought, well, this is a good thing because it'll get people on campus and that sort of thing. And so I gave a story about a coach in South Carolina who had to apologize for being pro-life. And I said, that's where we are in the university setting. Well, it turns out that my provost then, not the same provost now, told me that very much upset the president to point that out. And I just think that conservatives have to really give some thought about where we're going to do when young people are ready to go to college. Where do we send them? And I think the number of places we can send them continue to diminish. There tends to be a sense of wanting to radicalize young people with the hope that they'll vote in a radicalized way when the time comes.
Wonderful. Mr. Herring, thank you so much for coming on and defending your work. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you so much for having me.